or something, and he tried to like instigate like a new Hitler Youth or something like that.
I have
Anyway,
not heard of that one.
speaking of kawaii visual novels, uh, should we like introduce ourselves?
Yeah, we are Second Look. I am Bleep,
And this is the voice of Joy Mac.
the person who's done like almost all the narration, while I just slapped images together.
That's not true. No, that's not fair. Um,
It's okay. I made up for it with this. I consider us even now.
I think this is your penance for not even like I don't think you've been enough of a weeaboo this year, and your visual novel streak is like to compensate for that. You have to keep it up.
That's true. Yeah, this is a different format from what we usually do. We originally wanted to do this as like a podcast, but decided to go the more trendy video essay route.
True.
But this is just going to be a straightforward review of one thing without like a meta contextual framework.
Yet you don't know
We're
that.
actually yeah, this one's actually about Lacan. We'll explain why later.
Something to do with like phalluses and Monica.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
You're probably right though.
so like a little bit of an intro to the world of Doki Doki Literature Club. It was created primarily by a guy called Dan Salvato, who I believe is American. This is kind of like the second big, I would say, like successful Western visual novel. So, and it's kind of following a precedent at this point. There seems to be a lot of like visual novels coming out from like Western authors that tend to be like visual novels with a twist. And I think that's actually something that's quite interesting to talk about. Before this, there was the infamous visual novel. Can you guess what I'm talking about, Blake?
Undertale.
Katawa Shoujo. It does in many ways almost feel like a spiritual successor.
Including there being like over 1,000 or over 1,300 threads on 4chan about it.
Yeah, exactly. It's been very popular the last couple of years. It's actually I think it's getting an update this year. I think there was supposed to be some kind of sequel or follow-up was scheduled or hinted to be scheduled for 2018.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that came to fruition. But I think Dan's actually made like an announcement fairly recently that he's going to follow up Doki Doki Literature Club.
That's right. He's going to add some sort of new content, but it's not going to be a sequel or anything like that.
From what I know, it was actually like quietly announced a few years ago in the form of an ARG on a website, not like a full scale one, but like a kind of like a spooky website with some like metadata that like hinted at a follow up of DDLC, with some spooky elements to it, which is interesting. So I would be very interested to see where that goes, because this game is, in small circles, it can be controversial. It seems to be the kind of game that people either really, really like or really, really don't like. Which camp do you fall into, Blake?
Yeah, before we go into the actual gameplay, let's discuss our viewpoints going in. I think we discussed before we started, my viewpoint in summary is no.
Yeah.
And I think yours was a bit more nuanced.
I think my big takeaway from this was that I was really disappointed with how it dealt with mental illness. That was like that was a major selling point for the visual novel itself, was that this is like a visual novel with a twist, which again like follows up with Katawa Shoujo, which was another popular Western visual novel, because Katawa Shoujo had schoolgirls who were physically disabled or impaired in some way, whereas this has more, it focuses more on like mental kind of illness or disability or that kind of thing. Well, it's sort of I don't know if it goes all the way, but it was definitely one of its major selling points, especially one scene in particular, Should we discuss that now or like save for a little bit later?
We can save that one.
All right. Well, big spoilers ahead, I guess, if you haven't played it. But
We are going to discuss the entire game in detail, so if you have not played it and are interested, play it first and then come back.
one of like the major selling points of this game was that it had a scene where one of the primary characters basically hangs herself. It's kind of out of the blue the way it's delivered, and it's very, I guess, would you even say it's really hinted at in the first part of the game leading up to that?
There are a couple very small hints, I think, but the way it's executed, we'll discuss how we feel about that in detail once we get to the scene.
The suicide element of the plot was like, I remember when it first came out, that was like the selling point of this game. It almost like reminded me of like I haven't seen that kind of like public reaction since like the 90s almost, because the internet almost kind of like desensitized us to a lot of stuff. And I remember when I was like a kid, people used to like, especially like kids would have been like, oh, did you hear about this like secret thing in this piece of media, or something really terrible happens, or you can hear like, I remember when I was a kid, like someone said you could see like in the background of like Wizard of Oz, like there's someone hanging themselves, and that was like a rumor. To me, it's got that same kind of like word of mouth. Oh, you should like totally like check this thing out. It's got this thing in it. Even like horror films, like Blair Witch Project and stuff. I think like capitalized on that same kind of word of mouth shock value kind of thing to sell itself.
I think that's a big part. The climate in which it came out, just the whole meta narrative thing, because in the context of video games, like that's those like childhood rumors of like Mew being under the truck or whatever are
Yeah,
true, like actual things in the game,
yeah,
which is really awesome. And it came out on like the tail end of 2015, which was like Undertale and Pony Island and all these like meta games coming out.
yeah. Yeah, that's important. I remember around that period there came like a lot of like the 2010s was like very much like a almost like a golden period, like the beginning of one anyway for like indie games. And
Mm-hmm.
we had like that flush, I think, of like in the early 2010s there was a lot of like cheesy cliche like 8-bit pixel games, and like almost like cynical, like you saw like a lot of asset flips and stuff on Steam, and I think some developers were starting to get like a little bit like self-conscious, which I think is inevitable. Once any kind of like art tends to get like really popular, because the 2010s were like the very much the decade that indie games got like a really entered like the public conscious, I think. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it was inevitable that you were going to have like people who were going to make games, and those games were going to be like, yeah, messing around with like the notions of what makes the video game and all the tropes and that kind of stuff, which I think is inevitable with any kind of like art form.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty interesting to see it happen with like such a young art form too. Like video games are what, like, popular since the early
Yeah,
80s. Like they were around before then, but then they were in the mainstream since then. So,
yeah,
40-year-old medium already having like this meta contextual thing to it.
yeah. It's been very interesting to see that develop, and Doki Doki Literature Club is very much within that kind of vein of, I guess, metatextual whatever video games.
Mm-hmm. I do think it tries to be a meta narrative.
It does. It definitely does. That leads to the question, which I guess we can discuss later. Like what exactly is the message of Doki Doki Literature Club, if there is any, or is it just shock value? Which I think is an interesting question.
My question going in was, yeah, what is it doing, and does it succeed at any of that?
Yeah, and well, I guess we can get to that in a little bit, but I think it's already obvious how we feel about it. But basically, to go back to the original point, was that mental illness is a big theme of this game. I want to get into that. Do you want to get into that at the moment? Like, the actual plot of the game?
Yeah, I think we can get to that specific point going through the plot because there will be a very clear place where we can discuss that.
Yeah. Yeah, so mental illness is very much like a big part of this game story.
Mm-hmm.
In two different ways mainly. Well, two characters' mental illness is a big part of what drives the game, especially the first half, which leads up to Sayori is the girl who kills herself for suicide, and eventually after that comes Yuri's descent into mental illness. But we should actually like explain the basic premise of the story. That'd
Yeah,
be a good
let's get
thing.
into the actual gameplay. All right, so interestingly, the game opens up, and interestingly, I think that there's a lot to be said in just like the opening warning message and the title screen and stuff like that. Just because I think it does reflect one of the issues of the game. When you first open the game, you get this long like warning that it deals with mental illness and there are disturbing things, and kids probably shouldn't play it. And then you agree that you have to be 13 years old or older. Like there's an actual button prompt for that. And then
Yeah,
the game does its
yeah.
normal opening, which is the a very similar but short message again. So it really drives home the fact that things are amiss, which I can respect from a certain aspect because going into the game not expecting suicide is probably going to genuinely disturb a lot of people. But I think there's probably a better way they could have done that without like
Well, it ties back to what I was saying about like the shock value. Like that was definitely put into like I think there's a lot of moments in this game because this game also came out when like let's players and stuff were starting to get really popular. And there's definitely like a couple of moments in this video game where they like maximize the shock value, and I think they were specifically designed for people to have their interest hooked in a visual way, like watching a let's player play it. And I think that message at the start of the game is definitely one of those points.
I definitely agree. It's very much seems to be directed at streamers and let's players and such. And I think that other metagames have done that as well, but not in the same way. Like Undertale will have moments where they call out people for like watching the super violent run. Like there's that one line that's like, haha, you're watching someone streaming it because you couldn't do it yourself. Which was really neat, but
Yeah, yeah, I remember that.
DDLC does it in a totally different way.
Yeah. Um it's it's got this it's very trying to like drive home this shock value kind of thing for viewers, and I can just imagine like someone like a let's player being like the thumbnail of some like YouTube video where they're looking with their heads with their hands on their heads like looking shocked, and like there's a pixelated image of like the suicide scene in the background. And
I was looking for images, and there was 100% at least like a dozen of those.
exactly, like you won't believe what happens, or like playing crazy suicide game or something like that. And just to go back to that like word of mouth rumor kind of thing, what's really interesting is that for some reason a whole bunch of like British newspapers picked up on this video game
Oh,
like
I remember
years
that.
after it came out and wrote about it as a dating app. And a, a dating app that like encourages suicide or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean,
That's one
if
way to
Dan
frame it.
Salvato set out to achieve that kind of thing, he's done a good job.
All right, but back to the plot. We're on the title screen. All right,
Yeah,
so the game opens and it's pretty typical dating sim. Well, when I say typical, I'll get into that later. It starts off as like a standard dating sim. You're introduced as the main character who is coded and referenced as a male, and you're introduced to Sayori, which is your childhood friend growing up, and you walk to school together every day, all that jazz. School starts, and she asks you what club you want to join and tries to convince you to join a club she's in called the Doki Doki Literature Club.
I don't know if it's actually called the Doki Doki Literature Club. I think it's just called.
I'm
the
pretty sure it
Literature
is
Club,
at least a couple points.
Fair enough.
So yeah, that's the general premise. You are joining a literature club with your childhood friend, but then you meet the cast of the game. There's what are their names? There's Natsuki, who's like the soon.
They're so memorable.
I know, and there's Yuri, who's like the goth. Is that why you went for her, by the way? Because I know you went her route. And and there's Monica, who is the club president, and she takes kind of a back seat at this point of the game.
Yeah. Foreboding. Oh.
Ooh. Yeah, there's actually a lot of that. As you start the day, you talk to Yuri, who's like super into books because she's goth. And she's reading a horror book, and like you constantly get these little themes like, oh well, there's usually more to horror than just what's on the surface. Like I actually try to keep count of the times it happens, which I think I put in my notes even, and then I just like eventually gave up and lost count.
Yeah. It really like lays it thick in the first act of like, oh, that not everything is as it seems. Oh, spooky game. Oh, that kind of thing.
It doesn't stop either.
Yeah, it like hits you over the head. It's like, do you get it yet? Do you get it yet? This game is meta. Ooh, aren't you intelligent for playing it? It's yeah, it's got that kind of feel to it. It's not subtle at all.
So the day proceeds, and you eventually decide to read poetry together or write poetry together for one reason or another. And so the next day, basically, actually, do you write the poem that day? I don't think you do.
I don't think you do.
So yeah, that's basically the intro. The first day is actually pretty quick, and like it's kind of interesting because you're actually introduced to new things.
Yeah.
And then it's all downhill for like 5 hours. But we'll get into that.
The first half.
We'll get into that. All right, so you're assigned with writing a poem. So the game has a pretty cool mechanic where you have to write a poem based on keywords, and depending on the keywords that you pick, it will appeal to one of the three girls. So if you pick a bunch of like bubbly and happy phrases, it'll usually appeal to Natsuki. If you pick like kind of, I guess, natural and sometimes depressing words, it'll appeal to Sayori. And if you pick like dark or depressing or horny words, it will appeal to Yuri.
Yeah.
Like actually she likes horny words.
Yeah. That's a big part of her character, which I guess we can get into in a bit.
Yeah, that'll come later. And so yeah, you write a poem, and then the next day, depending on the girl you go to, you aim for. We both picked Yuri in this route. This is my second route, and this is your first time playing, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the first time I ever played, I picked Natsuki. This time I picked Yuri to kind of go along with your route. So I picked Yuri too.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on the girl that you pick, you'll kind of get like extra scenes that day with that person.
Yeah.
So you start out with that, and it's basically you and Yuri trying to read a book for like a solid 20 minutes, and that is all that happens.
It's so bad. The build up,
and there's a running theme of that. Go on.
The build up is like, I can understand something being like slow paced, but or slow burn, but so much of the first half of the game is just irrelevant shit that was put in just to flesh out everything else. Yeah, like the book thing with the biscuit or the chocolate or something.
Oh, that's the second day. Don't spoil.
Oh, sorry. Well, still, like there's so much stuff. It's crazy. And then yeah, like the whole build up of like who's going to do what for the. They have like a literature festival,
Mm-hmm.
and they spend like at least like 10 minutes of dialogue, like fighting over who gets to make the fucking cupcakes or something. And it's like, oh my god, just like the game sets you up to know that there's like something seriously wrong, and then it just like puts up this wall of like shit, um, of like total irrelevant stuff that doesn't do anything to build the characters that much. It's just like anime girls being kawaii anime girls. And I'm sure like most people were just going, yeah, 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 okay, get to the hanging, for most of it. And it's such a slow burn.
I can't emphasize this enough, but it is so much worse if you've already played it before.
Yeah.
Because you don't even have like the excitement of something's gonna happen.
Yeah.
You already know it's gonna happen, so there is no reward for this.
Yeah. It's and then it starts to do that whole like groundhog day shit, which just makes it
Mm-hmm.
so much worse where you're like repeating the same dialogue over and over again.
Yeah, we'll get to that. All right, so you do your thing with the girl of your choosing, in our case Yuri, and then it's time to share your poetry, which is like its own tiny mechanic where you can pick which order you want to read the girl's poems in, and I
Yeah.
think that like adds to their affection towards you. So you share your poems, they kind of review yours. You get some writing advice from each girl, and you also get a kind of a cool little scene where you get to read their poems, and they all have their own like little individual theme songs, and they all have their own handwriting, and it's kind of well done in that sense.
Yeah.
The poems themselves are really bad, so that kind of takes away from that.
I mean, I didn't mind that too much because the poems were like they were serviceable.
Mm-hmm.
They were a vehicle to get across the point of each of the characters' kind of personality, which I think that yeah, a big part of every character's personality was made known through what they were writing in their poems and why they chose certain themes or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that wasn't such a bad section of the game. I think they did a good job like fleshing out the characters through that. And it makes sense given that it's supposed to be a game about poetry or literature. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the poems themselves are awful.
Yeah, they do a lot of that hammering
Yeah, they
in
do.
every way they can. Like as I said when I was introducing the characters, they're all like their own archetype, but then they try to break from that archetype. You didn't do her out, but Natsuki's is actually kind of interesting because she has like actual problems that are
Yeah,
tangible by
yeah.
people.
Well, I did research into like Nasuki's character, Natsuki,
Mm-hmm.
and I actually think that as a character, Natsuki is probably the most like human of them all. She has the most serious problems, and she has the most um human reactions to things.
Yeah, I agree.
Sayori, who's like clinically depressed, um, does such a good job of trying to be upbeat in a way to hide her depression almost that it's almost cartoonish.
Mm-hmm. It kind of undermines itself because like you do eventually find out that it is a front, but it's so sudden.
Yeah, exactly. And then Yuri's character, I don't even know where to start with that. She's just she's just crazy. And it gets worse later on in the game. But Natsuki's character actually seems to be the most human, the most realistic of all four. And
Mm-hmm.
it's such a shame because maybe it's not a coincidence that she got the least amount of time in the whole game.
That's true. That's something I'll get into later, where she's kind of snuffed in the second half of the
Yeah,
game.
it's really weird.
But and I also get what they were trying to go for with Yuri, but we'll get to that too.
Yeah, but Natsuki definitely has the most interesting character. I think of the three girls that you can date or kind of date or whatever, and it's such a shame that that's not really developed upon.
Right. And as I'm looking through my notes, I'm actually having trouble of like, what do I talk about next? Because it's kind of the same thing for like 3 in-game days. You just have like increasingly awkward anime romantic moments with the girl you chose, and you kind of get to know her a little bit better through that. And that goes on until like the last day. Do we just want to skip to that, I guess?
Go ahead, yeah. I think one thing I want to talk about though is that Monica's poems
Mm-hmm.
start to Monica's poems are your first clue into the true nature of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that was one of the few things at the very start that was done fairly subtly.
Mm-hmm.
But then yeah, it kind of like quickly picks up. But I think that's one thing they did an okay job with in the writing. Because with the whole depression and the suicide thing, they kind of hit you over the head. But that one's slightly more subtle.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I have to say. That's their one brownie.
Yeah, anything they try to do subtly is kind of destroyed by everything else.
Yeah.
I think that's a running theme. All right, so let's just skip to the last day. So they go through their club stuff. You pretty much go through the same routine of writing a poem every day, trying to appeal to a girl to unlock scenes. And this all does kind of matter in the sense that when you do a scene with a girl, you get like CG art, and getting all the CG art actually unlocks a thing, but we'll get to that during the very, very end. So on the last day, Monica, who is still basically just a background character, suggests that you all participate in the school festival and that you all like do poetry readings. And of course, everyone's kind of super nervous and opposes the idea at first, but then she eventually convinces everyone to actually do it. And that's probably like the entire 30-minute segment of reading summarized. So you are assigned, you can actually pick which girl you want to work on or work with for the event.
I think it's actually worth mentioning that this is one of the most painful segments of the whole story. This just them discussing the points of like the festival and then arguing and then you having to pick. It was so tired and slow and such a slog.
It's kind of like if you're watching The Shining, except instead of like cutting into the story, like the first hour is Jack and the real estate dude discussing like details
around.
of this, like,
yeah,
and like payment rates.
yeah, and like looking in the fridge, see like is it nice and cold, and
Mm-hmm.
how does the toilet flush, and all this kind of stuff. Like that's the level that it's at. And then once it actually comes, the thing is they do such a good job of making the characters unlikable in many ways because Yuri and Natsuki don't get along.
They're kind of assholes to each other, yeah.
Yeah, they're kind of bitches to each other, and Sayori is just. I mean, even the main character thinks Sayori is so annoying, and it actually asks you like, which one of these lucky ladies do you want to spend time with?
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, well, fuck me, I don't want to spend time with any of them.
And the game just like
they're all horrible.
And the game straight up just doesn't let you spend time with Monica.
Yeah. Plot point.
Ooh.
At that point in time, she's like probably the least annoying of the four.
Mm-hmm. She's more like a teacher, motherly kind of figure at this point.
Yeah. So when it does come to having to pick the three, it is like it's almost painful because you don't want to condone the personalities of any of the three because they're all horrible. The reason I picked Yuri is literally I just went eeny meeny miny mo, catch a tiger by the toe, because I couldn't burn myself to actually have to like pick one.
Why did I pick Natsuki at first? Probably because she's the Soon and I hate Soons.
Fair enough. And then it turns out she's actually the most human character.
Mm-hmm. So I win.
Okay.
All right, so you can pick which girl you want to help at the festival, and don't worry, we know there are specific roles for everyone. Natsuki is going to bake some cupcakes, and Yuri is going to make some flyers and streamers and such. We know these details. It was integral to the plot.
It's so important. They go at great length to let you know these things.
And then the girl you pick, you get to know like even more details, like what streamer color you're going to pick, and see, we're symbolically grinding the podcast to a halt, just like the game does. All right, so you get to you pick your girl, and you go help them for the day. And at some point before that happens, you have an encounter with Natsuki, or not Natsuki, Sayori. Their names. You have an encounter with Sayori, who's like freaking out for some reason, and it turns out that she's really depressed and jealous of the time you're spending with the girls, even though that she invited you so that everyone could be happy together and she could continue her whole being happy for a front thing, but she can't take it anymore for seemingly no reason, and it's actually hinted why that is a little bit later, but it is very much out of nowhere. You're just kind of like doing your normal daily routine thing, and then Sayori goes into this like big revealing rant about how badly she's always suffered with depression and how she can't get out of bed, and that's why she's late every morning, and it's not just like a wacky anime thing. And it kind of feels like a friend actually coming out as like depressed and having issues to you a little bit, kind of.
Yeah, this is, I think, when I said that like the game is close to actually being good, this is what I mean. This is maybe one of the more like salient or impactful points in the whole story, where Sayori comes out to you as depressed in a way that is very realistic. You know, as to someone who actually does have mental illness in real life and wants to open up to her friend, they actually did like a fairly good job of portraying that. But then it starts even before Sayori's suicide, it gets really strange because she's like, I'm so depressed, but maybe being in a relationship with you will make me happy more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the classic like woman with problem wants all her issues solved by a penis kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I know that like mental illness representation is like super starved in media, and most of it does end up being that trope. If you do personally relate to the game and it did help you work through your depression, good on you. That's great.
Yeah.
But I do still feel like that it does end up boiling down to that trope still.
Yeah, and it's really sad because there was like a glimmer of decent writing. And it's such a shame as well because we really don't get any good representation at all of mental illness in media ever.
Mm-hmm.
And it came close to actually being like one of the few pieces of media out there that actually do a decent job. And then it's almost insulting what they do next.
I actually don't entirely oppose the idea that she ends up killing herself. I think that it's actually good to depict the idea that you can't just like save your friends with the power of friendship or with your penis.
Yeah.
But
Bud
is doing a lot of work right now. They undermine that in every way they possibly can throughout the second half of the game. So there's that. And we'll get to that.
It's bad stuff. But back to the festival.
Woo! All right, time to talk about streamer colors. All right, so you rush home after confiding with Sayori and making her calm down. And you spend the day working with Yuri on streamers and flyers and art and stuff, and it turns out that she has a knife hobby, which we'll be seeing again later. um
When someone says foreboding, this is like this is like next level. It's like, yeah, I'm obviously mentally unstable and I collect knives. Do you wonder how that's going to come into play later on?
What's that one literary device? Someone's gun?
Smoking gun?
No, it's like an author's name gun.
I have no idea.
Hold on, I'll edit this part out so you don't look stupid. I have to know the name.
Fair enough.
Narrative gun. Chekhov's gun. Alright, so there's a literary device called Chekhov's gun, where, like, it's basically like, if there's a gun in a piece of media, it eventually has to be fired. And that's a big trope. It's like, it's worlds beyond that.
Yeah. I mean, authors put things into the story intentionally, and I don't even know what to say about Yuri's character, honestly.
We'll get to that. You have that whole scene, and then at the very end, you kind of have like you go outside and have kind of like an almost kiss moment. But Sayori comes and sees you, and then she gets super upset and has like an actual mental breakdown, screaming and crying in the middle of the street, and then she runs home. And the main character just goes, "Welp, that was awkward," and the next day happens. And that's that day. So this is like, I think, the fourth day and the final day of this arc. And the day starts by you kind of worrying about her. She doesn't answer her phone, but you kind of like yeet off to school anyway. And this will be a thing I discuss later.
Is it Monica?
Oh yeah, you go and talk to Monica because it's like, you go through the whole day and go through... Yeah, you go through the whole day and then you're at the literature club. And then you talk to Monica, and she's like, "What the actual fuck?" Like,
better go check on your friend.
I screen capped a line. So, Monica, this is for Monica. You should take a little responsibility for her. Well, I named myself Bleep, so Bleep. I mean, especially after your exchange with her yesterday, you kind of let her hanging this morning, you know?
Fuck me.
And at that point, I thought I was going to like prepare a fart sound effect for this part of the podcast. I think in my notes I just put "fuck off."
What's that thing? It's like a rim shot.
All right, so she convinces you to go check on her. You go into her house. It's just like really slow, actually kind of unsettling build-up, because you, the player, aren't a complete moron who would just leave your friend... Oh, I was about to say hanging. Fuck me. Who left your friend in trouble in a state of distress, and just like went their whole day going, "Well, hope they're fine." So you go into their house, it's all dark and quiet, and you go into their room, and then like the big hanging jump scare happens.
Yeah. Let's talk about the jump scare.
You find your friend's body, and it's all like distorted, and like the theme of the game plays, but it's all like slowed down and creepy, and the background's distorted.
So bad.
It's like a creepypasta. It's exactly like a creepypasta. And like you get like the game is programmed in the visual novel engine RenP, and there's like an actual error in the background at one point. Like it can't pull from a line or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like it does like a bunch of like dramatic cuts of her like body hanging there.
That's so bad. It really is like, it's as if you're watching a film and the main character comes across someone who's like dead, and then some guy like comes up to the screen and is like, "Oh my god, did you see that? She's dead. Do you get that? She's dead. She hung herself." It's the combination of the music and the visuals is just like, it's so in your face and so tacky.
To like steal a Mike Birbiglia bit, what they should have done was nothing.
Yeah.
Like, it just could have been her sprite hanging there with silence, and it would have been infinitely more
More effective.
effective. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that would have tied well into this idea that you can't save your friends, and the starkness of that contrasted with like the really emotional, like sentimental dialogue that happened the day before would have been a good contrast. It would have got the message across effectively.
Mm-hmm.
But they just decided to go with this again. It like ties into the whole like, I think this game was made for live streamers or YouTuber kind of thing, where they need like a really in your face like visual catch or hook. Um, I think that's why it's kind of cynical.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's cynical more than anything. It's a cynical presentation of suicide,
I agree.
for views, for cheap views, and nothing else, and that's really disappointing.
I think cynicism is kind of a big theme at this point because, like, so far
Yeah,
we've had this, like, what's supposed to be a depiction of, like, a bog standard, like, romantic visual novel, but, like, I'm not the biggest visual novel fan in the world, but even I have more respect for the genre than I think what this game has shown so far. Like,
yeah,
visual novels usually have, like, arcs and dramatic tension, and even if it's, like, a slice of life kind of a thing, they still have, like, things going on, and characters are developed, and you you can still have like a meta narrative and have the regular stuff stand on its own, and in this case it super does not. Like, you could have summarized like the entire like 4 3 hour session in like probably an hour at most. Even that might have been like pushing it.
yeah,
Like, it didn't
yeah.
focus on anything really. It was all fluff.
Exactly. That's that was the main issue of the first half of the game leading up to this scene. Is just there's no effort put into actually making like a good visual novel whatsoever.
Hmm.
I mean, it's serviceable, and yeah, it ties back to this idea of cynicism. Uh, the It would have been a better visual novel, visual novel, visual novel, and it would have been a better subversion of expectations had it actually been or started off as at least a good actual visual novel.
Hmm.
But it doesn't. It's all fluff that serves as a wall to the big shocking suicide scene. It's literally only there to to give you like a pretense
Hmm.
to deliver the big visual shock.
It's kind of like what I would imagine people who don't play visual novels imagine visual novels being, basically.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a big part of its success because it was such a shocking thing, and it got widespread success with people who don't usually play visual novels.
Hmm.
Um, so maybe they don't have the same level of scrutiny as someone who's actually familiar with visual novels, because there are visual novels out there that do a good job of subverting expectations
Hmm.
and playing around with like the limitations of the medium. And this game just completely ignores all of that,
Hmm.
and it acts like it's the first ever visual novel to have like a brain, you know. It acts as if like every single other visual novel in existence is just a silly kawaii dating sim ugu like the first half, and it's almost insulting in many ways, um to people who make visual novels. um I think, yeah, it's
Yeah, and that issue goes on to like the whole suicide depiction. Like, it starts out as like what you might expect, like your friend who's, it turns out, has been suffering from depression their whole lives might be. And it kind of
mhm.
does a good job at that, but then it's like completely undermined by like the whole shock value thing.
It's borderline offensive
Hmm.
to people who really struggle with suicide or have lost someone to suicide. To present it in this way is just um it's just really disrespectful to use it as such a tacky plot device and a shock device to get clicks. I really do believe that.
Oh, but don't worry, it doesn't stop there.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It gets worse somehow.
All right, so Sayori hangs herself. There's a big dramatic jump
Mm-hmm.
scare. It's really tacky.
Mm-hmm. Terribly done.
And that came after about like 4 hours of nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we're caught up.
Perfect. So the plot, or the execution of the plot rather, just gets completely off the rails from this point onward. It combines the worst of tacky use of mental illness, which Sayori's suicide sets the tone for, plus the absolute worst version of Groundhog Day. It's kawaii anime girls Groundhog Day, where they talk about nothing in particular over and over again, which we all just love. Which is so good.
As long as it's anime
fantastic.
girls, it's good.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, anime girls could literally just have, like, it could show you anime girls having diarrhea and people would eat that up. They'd be like, oh, that's fantastic character building. She really goes through difficult trials. So that sets the tone for the rest of the story. And then this is where Monica really comes into play.
It is.
Isn't it?
She'll be a big girl from now on. There was like one single issue with the entire game between the first chapter and the rest. It would be execution.
Mm-hmm. And pacing, which is part of execution, obviously. I find. I think a big part of the issue for me was that the first half of the game, up until Sayori's suicide, is just, it is kawaii girls doing nothing. It's like an episode of Lucky Star with a little bit of foreshadowing. And then it kind of jumps off the deep end when Monica has that kind of like Bond villain moment where she says, better check on your friend, don't leave her hanging. It sounds like something that a Bond villain would say to James Bond before he finds like Octopussy hanging above a tank of sharks or something like that. Leading up to that is just so slow, and then things kind of escalate so quickly, but they still do it in a really mind-numbing way. At least I find that personally with me, because, well, basically what happens is that things after Sayori kills herself, the particular segment of the game that leads up to her suicide right before that, if I recall correctly, starts
before
to
her
repeat
suicide,
itself.
no, it's just the day of the festival preparations, or the day before is the day of the preparations, which is when she has a breakdown, and then the next day is still just like the regular next day, and then she kills herself, and then we get back into the plot, which is the whole Groundhog Day thing. But we'll get into that.
It's just one big pink blur at this point. I actually replayed some of it yesterday to refresh my memory, and I still, like, I was zoning out. I just set the text to auto scroll and just looked at the wall.
I think it took me like 2 weeks to get through the first part.
It took you
and
forever.
Then, like, I got the rest done in like maybe 5 days.
Yeah, I did it in 2 sittings with my roommate because I wanted to play it on her computer because it's larger, way larger screen. So, and she absolutely hated it. And so I was like to myself, okay, then I should probably try and get this done as quick as possible. But if I was doing it at my own pace, then I probably would have taken forever. I think it's really interesting that it took me 2 sittings and it took you, 2 weeks?
So before we do get back into the plot, why we're doing this, since the game came out, it's of course gotten tons of praise and stuff, and there has been some criticism, but most of it is either like generic bad faith anti-anime redditors or whatever, and the other parts have been like, oh well, it's boring, but I think it handles suicide really well and things of that nature. So I don't think there's been a whole lot of like going after what the issue is with DDLC. very much.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big part of the motivation why we're discussing this.
And
isn't
we're
it?
years out now, so it's time to be like cynical YouTubers and say the thing you like is bad, actually. Mm-hmm.
It's cancelled, and you're cancelled. Good. Good.
True.
Easy clicks.
All right, so
Um,
the game actually hard resets and it goes back to the title screen. However, I will say, since I haven't said anything nice about it in a while, I do like how the title screen is presented. It like does the whole like pop in sync to the music, which is a nice little touch.
yeah.
But then upon reset, the title screen's different. It's got Monica sprite in place of Sayori, except it's like all glitched out and stuff, and the new game option is all glitched out, but you're supposed to click new game. Going back and like reloading a save file just results in the same thing over and over, so there's no real point in that. So you start a new game, which actually starts like a whole new arc of the story, because obviously Sayori is gone now, and the game has to compensate for that. So instead of Sayori introducing you to the club, Monica comes up to you and asks you if you want to join, despite like her not knowing you very well at this point of the story in the game's universe. But she seems super interested in you all of a sudden, and so you join the Doki Doki Literature Club again. But it should be noted at this point too that the player character isn't really developed very well, or if at all.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
I think the only things we know about him is that he is male and wants to be there for the girls and is Sayori's friend and likes anime, and that's really about it. We don't get much input from him. The Sayori bit is probably the most insight we'll get into his like feeling at the time, pretty much ever from now on.
I think it's really interesting because what little insight we do actually get into him, he comes off as really unlikable. He's really impatient with his friend Sayori, and he seems to be he doesn't really seem to care that much about the personalities of the girls in the literature club. His number one priority does seem to just be, how do we put it? Getting laid, basically. And that's about it. But on that point, one thing that I actually want to note is going back a little bit. Shortly after Sayori's suicide, I think, if I recall correctly, Sayori kills herself. I don't know. Am I right about this?
I'll have to check my notes 1 sec. Yeah, you're right, Sayori. Yeah.
He goes back to school. Is that right? I think he does.
No, he goes to. So what happens is there's like this big dramatic thing where Sayori has like a mental breakdown in the middle of the street.
Yeah.
And she like runs off to her house, and you just kind of like dab off to the next day.
Yeah,
that's when Monica like kind of taunts you with the better check, not leave her hanging line.
The thing, I just thought it was really oddly done, and his character is so, how do I put it, insensitive almost. He does come off as a bit of an asshole. But I guess that's kind of the point of the whole everything about the characters in the first place. They're all kind of unlikable in their own unique way. They're easy to hate, I think.
Is it supposed to be that though? Like, is it?
That's the weird thing. Like, there's definitely parts in the story where characters come off as really nasty, including Sayori. Sayori, towards the end of the game, spoilers, has her own, let's say, character flaws come up. And that part of all of the characters, at least to me, came off as very dislikable sometimes.
That's interesting. A thing I did want to bring up at this point, just because this is like the point of the game where I realized this, but I forget that they even like gendered the main character, because I assumed that they would want to be like, let's make the player project themselves upon the player character as much as possible. But
really?
There's like 2 points in the game where they specifically are like, haha, you must be this character's boyfriend. Like, And they could have just not.
There's a part early on where I think one of the subplots, and I could be wrong about this, is that Natsuki is hinted to be lesbian or bisexual, which is, I think that's my own personal interpretation, but I've heard other people say the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, early on in the game, one of the things that Natsuki, I think, says early on in the near the start of the game is that start of the visual novel, whatever. I know we're going to get people going, visual novels aren't video games. Ugh. But towards the start of the game, where Natsuki remarked that she doesn't want any boys in the literature club, she prefers it with all girls.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think there are certain parts of Natsuki's poetry which kind of suggests that she might be like a closeted lesbian. At least that's how I interpreted it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so it actually, they make a point quite early on to let the player know that you're playing as a male character.
Mm-hmm. And you could argue that, like, it is supposed to be like a kind of generic dating sim, so it makes sense to code the main character as male, but
Yeah,
they don't really do a good job at that, if that's the case. But they also kind of fail to make the character relatable to everyone at the same time, so it's hard to say.
when it comes to gender representation, there are other aspects of the game, lots of other aspects of the game that could be criticized, not just that the protagonist is a man.
Well, yeah, it's such a small thing, but it's like such a wasted opportunity, and it could have been solved with like
Easily.
2 line changes.
Yeah, no, I get what you mean. I think that's very interesting, actually, that they decided to code the protagonist as a male, because they kind of make a big deal out of it. I mean, one of the things to me, the way that the characters acted was because you were the only boy in the whole literature club. They were all, maybe not so much Natsuki, but the others were very much infatuated with you.
Mm-hmm.
And then, God, it was like a dog to vomit. They just couldn't stay away from you. And maybe that was intentional, especially with Yuri. Spoilers. Should we actually talk about Yuri? Because this is kind of where she starts to
Yeah,
come.
we'll be getting to that really soon.
Yeah.
So continuing with the plot, you start the club as usual. You kind of go through most of the same dialogue as you did the first time, kind of getting introduced to the characters, but they seem like they're a little bit more exaggerated this time. And and up to this point too, there's been like a couple of like visual glitches, which is where the meta stuff kind of starts.
Yeah.
Like sometimes text will be distorted, sometimes the music will kind of warp faster and slower. Like not so little touches like that.
Yeah.
It starts out like that running, basically.
I think this is where things start to get even more tasteless for me, because this is the part of the story where I think Monica starts really messing around with some of the other characters, especially in their dialogue.
Mm-hmm. It'll start hitting hard really soon.
Yeah. And things just really start to go off the handle here, in terms of character development, and it starts to get really, really edgy. At this point, to the point where it's eye rolling. I don't know how you felt about it though.
Yeah, I'll get into my feelings about that in here shortly. So the game continues on. You all agree to do the whole poetry thing again, and you're assigned to write a poem for the next day, and it's all more or less normal up to that point. So you go through the same like poem minigame where you have to appeal to one of the girls, except it's just Natsuki and Yuri this time. It's kind of interesting that some of the words that would normally excite Sayori now excite Yuri.
Oh, really?
Interesting thing I noticed. I don't know if it actually means anything, or if they just like some of the words overlap. There's a whole point system. I looked up a chart once. It's weird. But anyway.
It's really strange how they programmed this whole point system in and then do nothing with it.
Yeah, it's I think you can unlock bonus poems, like hidden poems throughout the game if you get like really high scores on some girls, but that's about it.
Oh, really? See, it wasn't really obvious to me. I just thought I was just clicking random words and seeing the little seeing the little chibi characters bounce up and down, because how it's actually indicated that you've picked a word that a girl likes is that there are little chibi avatars in the corner of a book,
Mm-hmm.
and they jump up and down, so you can pick stuff like, for Yuri, it's crazy shit like blood, edge,
I think
um,
yesterday I said that her words are like either deep, horror related, or horny.
or something crazy, desire, lust, and her little chibi character will be like, yay!
Yay!
That's
While we're
just
on
it.
that, during that section, did you ever get like a distorted or spooky looking sprite? Like chibi sprite?
No, but I did hear about people getting that. I actually tried to mess around with the game a little bit, just to see if I could get anything, because obviously it's the kind of game that you would think would have a lot of spooky hidden content.
Yeah, a lot of it's like random chance, like Yume Nikki style, where there's like a 1 in 16 or 1 in 64 chance a thing will actually happen. Which, interesting. Sure. Why not? The next day, MC returns to the club. There are various visual glitches, like Monica appearing in front of the text. Okay. All right. So the next day, we start getting a larger taste of the whole like visual glitch thing. Like,
Yeah.
Monica kind of appears in front of the text boxes sometimes. You'll have scenes with Yuri where like the background will be like at a Dutch angle and like super close up. I
Hmm.
think some of that stuff is kind of cool just because it's a lot more subtle than just like text being distorted or
Hmm.
like their
Yeah,
eyes
yeah.
exploding, which, yes, will happen later. It's like subtle points thrown in amongst extraordinarily not subtle points, basically.
Yeah, it loses the subtlety very shortly. See, this is what I mean, that the game comes close to actually being good, actually having a good execution. There are parts in it that are quite clever or subtle enough to not be completely gross. But then it kind of goes up and down in its presentation style of just how like tacky it wants to be.
It absolutely does cool things, but like The Room was one of the first films shot both digitally and on film, and that's a cool thing, but it's The Room, so
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you can't polish a turd. If for a visual novel you need good writing, and all
mhm.
of these kind of effects and stuff aren't gonna save that.
I'll do the Twitter clap thing. If you have like a meta narrative, you can still have a good story on its own.
Exactly. That's one of my huge issues with it. That really is, like, I think a major issue is that the game, because it's a parody, it doesn't seem to think that it needs to be a good story. It doesn't need to think that it's entertaining,
Hmm.
because, oh well, it's not sincere anyway. You're just playing it because you want to feel clever or something like that.
I'm trying to avoid other game references, but you can look at a game like Undertale, which came out around the same time, which is kind of sort of a meta narrative game. And it's
Hmm.
still like entertaining on its own. Like the gameplay is fun, the writing is
Hmm.
funny. It has
Yeah,
things that would exist if like Flowey and stuff wasn't there.
yeah. I mean, you can play a game like Undertale and know nothing about any of the kind of meta stuff to it
Hmm.
and still really enjoy it. Whereas with this, you're just explicitly playing it because you know that it's an edgy subversion of the visual novel genre, and there's a suicide scene that everybody talks about, and that's it. There's no actual substance to the story itself.
So speaking of the story, you have a very similar scene to the first time you're with Yuri, where like you start up reading a book together and all this happens, but she
Yeah.
seems a bit more unhinged at this point. Like she's in the first arc, she's like very contained and she keeps emotions under check, but she seems to really struggle with that from in this arc. And so you go through that whole thing, and you have your scene with her, except at the end, like the text does something spooky or something,
Hmm.
and then it's the poetry reading again. Yuri's actually left out this time because she's like suddenly super into her book where she can't pay attention to anything else.
Hmm.
So you can do either Natsuki or Monica. However, Natsuki is just like, no, go away. And you don't read her poem or anything. Let's see, does Monica do anything at this point? Oh yeah, she enjoys your poem. She's surprised it's deep. You seem to have retained like your poetry writing skills from the first arc, which
Mm-hmm.
is it's a touch.
Yeah.
It's definitely a detail that they added.
I think one nice touch that they do in this part is that Monica's poems start to like portray a kind of built-in self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
All together, they kind of depict like a story of her becoming aware of what's really going on, and over time trying to get her way out of it. Almost, it's done through the poems. It's a little on the nose for me. Some people completely missed it, so maybe they just got the level just right.
I'm not gonna lie, I read like 2 poems throughout my 2 playthroughs,
Fair enough.
so I
Yeah,
probably missed it too.
those are like huge things of the story.
Now we're gonna get called out that I like missed half the story, and that's why I hate it.
Well, fair enough.
No, I actually did read most of them, but not this playthrough. I actually couldn't read Yuri's because I genuinely cannot read her handwriting, and I didn't bother to look them up on like the DDLC wiki or whatever.
Now, this is the part. Is this roughly around the part where you start to cop on to Yuri self-harming?
We're getting there. What actually happens in this scene is Yuri is like incredibly impressed with your poem. Like she seems totally unhinged and fangirly.
Oh yeah, that's right.
That kind of attracts Natsuki over to the situation, and they get in a really like uncomfortable fight. Like
Oh my
Natsuki tells her to
god,
kill herself and stuff.
that was so awkward. I felt like I was walking into a real fight. This is this is this is definitely one of the parts of the story that felt a little too close to home, actually.
Yeah, it kind of does feel like really unhappy, edgy teenagers arguing with each other
Yeah,
in like the worst kind of way.
it just felt really awkward. Yeah, this is definitely the part of the story where I kind of realized that, God, everyone in this is just an asshole.
Yeah, I actually did enjoy that as a subversion of the first scene, just because
Yeah.
like they get in like a much more lighthearted fight the first time, and it's
Hmm.
just like okay, whatever. But this is like okay, wow.
Yeah, it's unusually grounded.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like the characters are actually almost real characters, like really based on people,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just like your stock Kuderi, Tsundere having a fight kind of thing. It feels like a real argument, and it feels really uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually, despite its level of edginess, it is actually one of the more to me, it's one of the points of the story or the writing that actually stuck out.
Mm-hmm.
It's a highlight almost. I'm hesitant to call it a highlight really because it's still really really edgy. It's almost. Have you ever played that other game called Honey Pop?
I have.
It's reminiscent of that kind of writing to me.
That I can see that.
Yeah, which because I've played Honey Pop recently and it scarred me because of how edgy it was. And I guess this reminded me of that and just made me really uncomfortable because it felt like I was almost playing Honey Pop again.
Imagine having your writing compared to Honey Pop.
God.
All right, so the next scene's pretty cool too. Monica eventually steps in and is like, "Hey, main character, let's get out of here because this is terrible." Which fair. And so she pulls you aside, and this is like kind of the first time that you're alone together. So she's like, "Hey, maybe we should spend more time together." And she starts like, this is the first time she really starts hinting towards her feeling towards you.
Yeah.
And then Yuri kind of pops in after the fight ends. Natsuki runs out, and she's like, "Oh, sorry." Yuri suggests that she and the main character stay together, and everyone agrees to it. But then her sprite glitches out, and you're like automatically warped to the next day.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like your first big indication that like, hey, maybe Monica's doing something.
Yeah, it is. If you didn't read the poems.
Okay, this is the stupid ass cutting scene. Okay.
Oh God.
Ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the next day, you meet up with Yuri, and she kind of apologizes for what's going on. But interestingly, Natsuki doesn't seem to acknowledge anything that happened in a way
Yeah,
that's like she genuinely doesn't realize anything even happened.
yeah.
Which, sure,
This is the part where you start to realize that maybe someone is messing around with Monica and Natsuki's heads, kind of.
they're kind of starting to get hints at like something's not quite right. Like I think she even says at one point that she's not normally like this, and something was actually genuinely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think this is the kind of the last point where I think that part's kind of done well, because the next part, again, you kind of repeat the next day's event with Yuri. I think the first time Monica, you have tea together, and Monica comes in and is like, "What are you doing?" And Yuri gets like needlessly defensive, but this time you're kind of left alone, except Yuri goes off to get some tea, and then she's not back for like 10 minutes. So you go out and look for her, and like you hear like weird sounds and cutting noises, and you turn the corner, and you see a quick flash of Yuri Sprite, like with her arm exposed, filled with cuts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just want to say that I don't think this added anything whatsoever to the story.
No, it's genuinely awful.
It's
It's just it's not like you can make some kind of argument that maybe, well, no, you can't, but there's at least something there to like, okay, well, maybe he didn't handle the whole depression thing that well, but it's at least an attempt to be there. This isn't even that. This is just it's jump scare, edgy shock value stuff.
Yeah, no, this is, I mean, there is a part where Yuri says that, and I actually find this kind of awful, that basically the excited that she gets,
Oh yeah,
the greater her urge is to cut herself. Um, when I read that, I just thought to myself, okay, all right.
Yuri didn't say that part. She said that she just gets really excited around you, but later on, Monica pulls you aside and is like, "Hey, maybe you shouldn't hang around Yuri. She like is prone to cutting herself when she's emotional."
Yes, yes, I didn't even know what to think of that.
Yeah, and then like that doesn't even almost happen.
Yeah,
Like if we're going by in the game's universe, I think that's kind of like a reasonable request, but it just never happens. The main character like never even tries to distance
yeah,
himself.
yeah.
It should be noted that at this point that we have no reaction from the player character of any of this so far.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting and confusing. When I was playing this and time was skipping around and Natsuki was like, "What are you on about?" to Yuri and all that kind of stuff. I was wondering, is the main character conscious of all of this? I mean, I guess not.
I think you could make the argument that the player character and like you, the player, aren't supposed to be separate entities, and that the player character's motivation is driven entirely by your own to like want to help Monica and see what's going on with the game's world.
Hmm.
But if that's the case, then it's also done really, really poorly.
Yeah, yeah. It's a bit odd. I didn't get, there was a bit of a separation between me as a player and then the main character, which I understand. But when you have that disconnect, then what happens is that your motivations as a player don't matter as much as the main
Mm-hmm.
characters. And what was the motivations of the main character really?
I am definitely going to touch on a big part of that, and like one of my biggest problems with this game as a meta narrative later. So put a
Hmm.
pin in that.
Okay, cool. Let's talk about that later. But anyway, if you want to continue.
So the next day, this is like day 3 of the
Hmm.
first arc slash second arc. So it's the day before the festival where you're planning everything.
Hmm.
The usual kind of happens, except like Monica just kind of completely snubs Yuri on duties. She's like, "Okay, you can make cupcakes, Natsuki," and then Yuri, she's like, "Oh, you just do whatever you want," and she gets offended over that. And then Natsuki gets upset because she apparently wants the club to be more like a small friend kind of a thing and doesn't want
Hmm.
new people to
Yeah.
join. So she gets like upset and kind of storms out. Yuri is like feels responsible to try to get her on Monica's side because Yuri is the club vice president at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But before all that kind of breaks out, you do the whole poetry thing again, except this is the thing that you referenced earlier, where you actually do share your poem with Natsuki for the first time this arc, and then she gives you hers. But her
Mm-hmm.
poem is like a big cry for help because she seems fully aware that Monica is doing something to them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, please don't tell her any of this. You're in danger. We're in danger. Please help. Which
Yeah.
is a really cool touch. You know, fine.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. I actually quite like that part. I think that is a big part of why I felt like Natsuki was the most human-like character of the entire cast. And then this is the part where she just disappears.
Yeah, her sprite glitches out, and then she's like, oh, ignore everything I just said. And then she takes a back seat for the entire remainder of the game. I don't even know if I'll be bringing her up again. That's a significant plot point from here on out. But yeah, before all this, honestly, she had like the most human reactions and like the most tangible like problems instead of just being generic sad or generic withdrawn. Like, she had like depth to her why she was
Yeah.
kind of an asshole.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually quite enjoyed that. I would really enjoy to play a visual novel where characters are written like Natsuki, where they're not just like stock kawaii anime characters and they've got real problems and they're kind of assholes sometimes.
Play you and me and her.
I will, surely. Yeah, I'm gonna give that a go, definitely, if that's anything like that, because it was so close to like a good piece of writing, and then poof, okay, bye Natsuki.
I can't say a single word about any of it without spoiling things, so I can't say anything.
Fair
But yeah,
enough.
play it, absolutely play it.
I will tonight then. I'll see if I can get a copy of it. Yeah, that was so funny because it's almost like a peak of the writing, like a roller coaster. It like peaks at this point and then just goes straight downwards. It just goes all downhill from here for me anyway.
All right, then literally like the cutting scene repeats
Yeah,
again.
again.
I don't know what else to say about that.
That's it's such a contrast between Natsuki's part and then just the usual shit with this game.
I think it's at this point where I kind of noticed that like there's been no pacing for any of this.
Yeah, yeah.
Like I said, they really just hit the ground running with the like major visual glitches.
Mm-hmm.
And like you're told from the start that there's something amiss too, which is a big part of why it's not as effective, I don't think.
Really?
Yeah, like I'm trying not to reference you and me and her again, but
You're trying so hard.
if they had tried a little bit better to like maybe have like a trigger warning that the game is going to cover certain topics, but not be like outright, there's something deep buried beneath the surface of this game. Ooh. Like having that being like the thesis of the entire first part and everything going on here, it could have been more effective. And if they like kind of slowly brought in the visual and glitchy elements more slowly so that like maybe people more experienced with visual novels would start noticing that there's something happening first.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, less experienced people wouldn't really catch on quite as quickly. That would be a nice little touch, maybe.
Yeah. This is just where the game, like, how do I put it? Just commits itself to just being tacky. This is the part where it doubles down on all of its worst aspects. Once Natsuki's out of the scene and Monica gets complete control over Yuri or whatever, this is the part where it just goes to fucking shit. For me, anyway, that's what I thought. And yeah, the pacing at this part is all over the show because it spends like 50% of the game building up. And then there's a little bit of up and down with Natsuki and Yuri being weird and all that kind of stuff. And then it just completely like goes full blast for about the last third to a quarter of the game. It goes from completely flat to 0 to 100, pretty much.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah, the pacing's very strange.
It's like 0, 8, 9, 10.
Whoever wrote the plot, Dan, let's assume Dan Salvato, wrote this story specifically with the idea in mind that he was going to have a big scary scene like Sayori's suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And then once that scene was in the story, he didn't know what else to do.
I actually really do get that feeling too. Like, that's clearly like the centerpiece of the whole game, but then like everything around it's like
Yeah, I mean, the first leading up to it, it just feels like the story is there to get you eventually to the suicide scene. And then once it actually happens, there's a little bit of dialogue, and then it just goes. It almost feels like the game is trying to finish itself. Because it's just like, yeah, okay, let's just get this wrapped up. Yeah, it's crazy. It's a crazy story. Oh my god, there's cutting. There's suicide. Oh my god. And then you're at the end of the story, and that's about it.
yeah, it almost feels like an obligation. Like, for some reason, Yuri had to be a self-harm person.
Yeah.
Because like I said, I don't think there was really any indication of that in the first half of the game. I think they were trying to go for like Monica was manipulating some like character flaw with each of them, but he didn't quite pull through with any of that. Like, he didn't really give much of an indication that Yuri cuts herself, and it's hard to even say what he even did with Natsuki, other than to make her slightly more aggressive and then make her vanish forever.
So spoilers for Natsuki are that her background story is apparently that she comes from an abusive home.
Mm-hmm.
And the story really doesn't do a good job of developing that at all. It's slightly mentioned if you go down a certain route, and I think is it Yuri when she's being possessed, let's say by Monica, says something like, "Why don't you go and pick up coins from underneath the vending machines?" Which I think is supposed to like suggest that, haha, Natsuki, you're poor, and your family are trash and beat you or something like that. It's just really tacky. And then she just poof, that's her gone. That's her character development. We're done with her. Now let's just get to the main story. Let's just it really does just feel like, let's just finish the story. Let's just hurry it up. Oh my god, Monica's an evil wizard. Ah.
All right, so moving on with the plot. This is where a lot of things happen very quickly, so it's kind of hard to keep it all together. I might mess up the order a little bit, but it's all the same thing. So it's the last poetry sharing part. The big thing being where you share your poem with Yuri, and her poem is like covered in an unknown bodily fluid and red spots, and she seems like incredibly overly sexual, and like she sniffs your poem and wants to keep it, and it's just really
this
weird.
is the part. This is the part where she says something like, "Oh, it's your poem. I don't even need to read it. It's gonna be the best poem ever, and I wanna cut myself with your paper so your body oils seep into my system," or something like that.
Oh yeah,
my god,
that was the thing that happened.
Jesus Christ.
Moving on. So yeah, then you get into like the planning for the festival proper, and you're left with a choice between who to help again, like you were the first time. What the game will do is it will force your mouse towards Monica.
Yeah.
You can pick the other girls, but it'll like reset the options until like all of them say Monica, and it'll do like a big full screen like glitch where like you can only pick her. And like the game will do a hard reset, and instead of like the company splash logo, it'll be like only Monica or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's like the big meta spooky thing for that section.
In case you haven't noticed, Monica may be up to something.
Spoilers. All right, and then the club adjourns, and Yuri really wants to spend time alone with the main character, and she kind of like half fights with Monica about it.
Yeah.
And then this is when like the big climax happens, and they finally agree, like, yeah, sure, stay here, nothing bad will happen, haha. And then Yuri, like, once everyone leaves, Yuri just like goes crazy, pulls out a knife and stabs herself in the chest.
Yeah,
like,
right in
just
the heart.
killing herself.
there's a little bit of foreboding in this part, because I think briefly before that she says something like my heart is racing or like pumping out of my chest, or she says something like I want to rip it out or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it does lead up to it decently, but it's still what it is.
It's still like really, really quite out of the blue. I mean,
and it comes off as more cartoony than anything, which seems really unfitting. What happens next is probably my favorite thing in the whole game, though.
Really?
Yeah, just because I think it's a really unique and like meta usage of the medium. Okay. So you're standing over Yuri's corpse, and like you just kind of see her laying there dead with a wound in her, and like all the text is just distorted. You can keep clicking forever, and nothing will happen. So you have to use like most visual novels will have like a skip button to skip past dialogue you've already seen. Mm-hmm. And you actually have to click that, and like in-game days will pass while you just watch your body sitting there, and like it'll actually have the visual effect where like you can see the colors start leaving your flesh, and you can kind of see her start to decompose and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Which is just like a really cool horror game thing that would have been absolutely amazing part of like any other better story. Mm-hmm. But instead it's on DDLC. And if any game ever does that in the future, I'll have to think about DDLC. And I'm pretty upset.
I think one of the things for me is that, in any other game, like a horror game, mm-hmm. I would have been, having to confront death in that way, which is never done in media, really. I think it would have been quite a clever and quite a bold thing to do. Mm-hmm. But just because the topic of this game is mental illness and self-harm and suicide, I don't think that this is how you don't present the topic of mental illness and depression like as a horror film.
If this was just like a horror movie death, sure, fine. But at this point, we're supposed to believe that Yuri has like self-harming issues and doesn't have control over her emotions, and so this is like the final result of that, which just feels really gross.
Yeah, there are two characters in this game which have mental illness, which are very clearly suggested, coded, or whatever. These are the characters that have some kind of mental illness, and both characters end up killing themselves. One in a really graphic, violent way. And come on. I think that's just doing a disservice, really, more than anything. It goes back to what I said before. I think that using mental illness and suicide in this way to scare people is just, it's really, really tacky.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we're in the final stretch. Deep breaths. All right, so, I think it's like actually like 4 in-game days later of you just watching her body slowly decompose, Natsuki comes in and to the club like normal, and she's like, oh my god, and she pukes and runs off.
And that's her forever.
She comes back, and then that's like, she just like pops and dies or something.
I think she gets deleted, is it?
Something. I've played the game twice now, and I still have no idea quite how she dies.
It's like Monica's controlling like the terminal, or like a Linux terminal or something like that, and she literally types in like delete Natsuki, and then she like puffs.
Yep, and so she's dead. And then Monica comes in like, oh, you're still here. Oh, how awkward. Sorry to leave you here during the whole weekend. Oh yeah, she's like, no, Natsuki's just like straight up killed off screen. That's when she does the console thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so she does that, and then she's like, hold on, I'll fix everything. And then she does like the whole... She basically deletes the entire game, quote unquote. Yeah. And so you're left isolated in a room with Monica. And that's where like the second biggest, like most noted thing in the game happens. Series of events, what have you.
Mm-hmm. This is the part where it really reminds me of live streamers for some kind of reason, because this is the part where she mentions, I think if you run like OBS or something like that, she brings it up and she says like, hello audience, or something like that.
Which is actually, really cool.
Quite clever.
Good ideas. lots of things happen during the scene, technically. So you're basically in like a one chair classroom with Monica in like CG
Outer
portrait mode.
space.
Yeah. Yeah, out the window is just like outer space and like weird distortion effects. So it's like there's nothing left in her world except her, and then the only thing that you can do with the game now is look at her.
Yeah.
And like cool little things like that, like you said, can happen like with the OBS thing, and if you like close out of the game and come back, she'll be like, "Oh, I felt like I died for a second. Could you not do that?" And and if you like sit on the screen for a while, she'll like bring up various topics, and there's like quite a few things that she'll talk about. And she goes on this whole big monologue about how she didn't want to be like a background character in the game anymore, and that she loves you, the player, for some reason. And that's why she like did all this so that she could get rid of the other girls and finally be with you, which is where my biggest contention comes from with this game as a meta narrative. If her goal is to appeal to you, the player, why would she do like super spooky horror visual novel anime girl shit and like try to kill the people that you're supposed to be like getting to know in like horrible graphic ways? Doesn't make sense to me in like an in-game universe explanation, because I think a big part of meta narratives is that it has to justify itself as a meta narrative. Like there still has to be a in-game reason for you, the player, to be part of it, and I don't think this game does that at all. Like I said, if you are supposed to be the player character and like you're supposed to project your motivations and stuff upon them, and that's what's carrying the game forward, like that's asking a lot given what the game gives you.
Yeah.
So I don't think they succeed in that way. And also, like, you being an entity which a character in the game loves doesn't really make a whole lot of sense either, just because you're presumably like that from the very beginning. Whereas if it were something that were to happen mid-game, that would make a lot more sense. But it just never really happens that way to me.
If what were to happen mid-game?
If like Monica were to suddenly have like some sort of epiphany, like, oh, I like this person, you the player, for some reason.
Well, I think maybe because you are the main character, every girl is supposed to just be in love with you, and maybe she's part of that. I think, I mean, my automatic response to that would be something like, well, she's power hungry and she's crazy. I think something like that. And maybe she just does these things because she's not rational. But then I think, well, if she is literally like God in this universe where she can do pretty much whatever she wants, she could have just not tortured her friends.
Yeah, that's my big thing. Like, why do that when you're trying to get on someone's good side, presumably?
Yeah, and I this is one of the really, really low points of the game for me. I think this is the part where Monica mentions that she was like messing with variables to make the other characters like more mentally ill. Which is so, oh my god, like that one throwaway sentence just undoes like 80% of the plot. I mean,
basically. So instead of like having a thing where like you tragically lose your best friend to suicide, it's just Monica did it because she wants your dick.
It's so bad.
Instead of like dealing with flawed characters who have like major psychological issues, it's just Monica did it.
Yeah, and that really pissed me off, because we really don't get in any media at all any kind of depiction of mental illness where, you know, sometimes people just have mental illness. It could be anything. It could be depression, it could be BPD, it could be schizophrenia, it could be any of these things. And sometimes, you know, there's no easy explanation for why those things happen, and there's no easy cure for them. And sometimes that's just something that we have to learn to deal with as part of our lives. And I thought that this game could have said that. This game could have said that we can't always control mental illness, and we can't always control what happens to people, you know, who really suffer. and that's okay. That's part of life, and that's part of coping with mental illness.
I think I said during the first part that I think it's super good to depict the idea that you can't just like save your friend from depression with the power of friendship or whatever.
Yeah,
Except
exactly.
it turns out that Anime Girl Sans did it. So
Yeah, it turns out that actually in this game, mental illness, it has the polar opposite thing. It's not that it doesn't have any clear cause. It's because there's some character who's literally like Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, pulling the levers and buttons and like pushing up the slider that says craziness or something like that, or like activate self harm mode. And like all of the effort that the story puts into trying to develop these characters as mentally unwell is just completely fucking undone because it turns out that actually a wizard did it. And that is just so sad. That is really depressing to me. The fact that they didn't have the balls to just say, some people just have serious mental illness, and that's it. They had to attach it to some like easily fixable thing because it's not really that Sayori has depression. It's just that she has I don't fucking know, a curse or something from an evil witch. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. Like, yeah. And I think that, I don't know. I think maybe the writers were too scared to say that one of the main characters in this video game could have depression. Maybe they were just too scared of like actually having one of their characters be like that. And maybe they were just looking for an easy way to say, oh, she doesn't really have depression. She's just subject to Monica's evilness or something like that. And that really annoyed me.
Speaking of depressing, so throughout all this, you're given kind of like little, well, not even hints. She just straight up tells you, if you go to a certain game folder, you can just kind of delete characters. Haha, that's what I did. Haha, ha 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 ha. And then, that's what you have to do. You actually open up your game's install directory and you go into a characters folder and there's like a monica.chr or whatever, and you delete it. And you restart the game, and it's the end game now. You did the last thing.
Monica's like, "Oh my god, no! Oh, you actually did it! Oh my god, you actually did the thing."
You did the thing that I told you to do like 50 fucking times. So you restart the game, and Monica's like glitching out, of course, and she's like, "No, what have you done?" And as she's like dying off, she's kind of like, "Oh, I regret everything. I shouldn't have done that to my friends. Here, let me revive the world for you without me." And then the game does a hard reset again, and everything is normal, except Monica is not on the title screen this time, and Sayori is. You saved Sayori.
Yay!
And so you start a new game. I don't even have the energy anymore. You start a new game, and you start the literature club again, kind of like how you did the first time. And then she's like, "Oh, well, I'm the club president now, so I'm the new Monica, and I just want to be with you." Oh, and then like
Monica's soul or something.
So like then like prompts from presumably you, the player, come up that are just like, "No, I don't want to do this. There is no happiness in the Doki Doki Literature Club," and then the credits roll.
That's Monica, is it not? That's like
no idea.
Monica's spirit lingering on.
I thought it was like prompts from you, the player, honestly, like things that it presumed that you, the player, would be thinking.
No, because she's like, when Monica, does she not come back and be like, "I'm sorry," and then like, "Thank you, protagonist," or "Thank you, player," or something like that? Like, it says that she is. At this point, your brain is probably just fried. I'm sure you were just like, "Fuck this," but I'm pretty sure it's Monica, like Monica's ghost or something.
You get like her voice clip at the start of the credits. It's like, "Oh, I've been practicing piano for you," and it's like a vocal version of the game's main theme. Except it's all like live and has a vocalist and lyrics, and the lyrics are, of course, incredibly on the nose with the game's plot. And the credits roll, and you get the like little console thing in the corner again, and the game's like just slowly deleting its files, presumably.
Yeah.
And after that point, if you restart the game again, then it's like it gives you like a secret letter that's like "Thank you for playing," and then the game closes itself.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you get a goodbye letter from Monica.
Yeah.
It's like, I finally understand the literature club is truly a place where happiness can happen. Blah 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 blah. So yeah. You're right.
Yeah. Well, that's take a breather. You've got through it.
We did it.
Congratulations.
All right, so we did cover most of the alternative endings. You can pick Natsuki, not Natsuki. We already talked about her route. You can pick Sayori, however, her route's just really not much different. I think instead of like, you might get like an extra hug at the end from her GC or CG. That's about it. Yeah, and that's about it. So let's go over a few alternative endings and bonus stuff. So if you go through the game in a way that lets you get all the CG art, which is possible in one playthrough, you get a secret letter from the developer. So that's nice. He kind of goes into his like motivations behind the game. It's kind of an interesting read given the context of the things we've been discussing. So I can suggest Googling that. It's on the DDLC fan wiki. The game actually contains some secret files. I think Monica's like character file is one of them. If you like decrypt it, it turns into an image, and then you can warp the image to say things. Basically, all the things are hinting at his next game, which are coming out.
Yeah.
Like, there's some character art from it, and some like, I guess, diary entries from the characters in that game. So, sure. I should mention that like my least favorite thing in the world is when an ARG turns out to be an advertisement for something. So thanks for that. And I referenced earlier, but like random events can happen throughout the game. Like there's a chance that you'll get spooky sprites, or that slightly different jump scares will happen than what you would normally get in the game. There's some like spooky, skinless, chibi sprites during the poetry sections.
Oh,
you
seriously?
Can get sometimes.
Are you serious? Oh my god.
Yep.
Why?
I also referenced earlier, there are multiple different hidden poems that you have to meet certain poem writing conditions to get. And they're mostly like abstract and stuff and like distorted stuff, and some of them are kind of neat. You can find all of those on the wiki as well. And there is speculation that the developer's next game is actually based on the book that Yuri wants to read with you. So that's a fun little detail.
That is nice. I mean, this is the thing about this game. I can tell that a lot of love has went into it, almost.
It is absolutely a passion project. I can say 100%.
That much. Like, I can see that. And I mean, I can appreciate that, and I think that is what saves the game in a way. And I'm actually looking forward to seeing what Dan Salvato's next game is, because I mean, DDLC comes close to actually being well executed, and I would like to think that his next game will be better.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know his history as a writer or a developer or anything, so this could have been just his first attempt at any of this. And, you know, writing a whole visual novel is really hard, so his next game could be better. You know, I don't think he's personally a bad person. Like, this isn't a call-out that, oh, a racist made this game. It's just a game that someone made that I didn't like.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth exploring, like, the reasons why it failed.
Yeah.
Still, even though it was like a free passion project.
Yeah.
But given its influence and stuff, I think it's worth evaluating.
100%. My main issue with it, as I've said before, is how it goes about mental illness. And I think that's the major problem with the game. And there are some other things, but that's the major thing. And that I just can't get over that. But, I mean, I think a a huge part of the issue here is, like I've said before, that I think he's written this game with things like live streamers and YouTubers and clickbait and that kind of stuff in mind to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that he's given that too much consideration in the writing almost. Because he's tried to emphasize shock value in a story that really doesn't do well with that kind of thing.
I do know that one of his previous projects was he wrote one of the big like plugins for Twitch.
Oh, really?
I would
Well,
assume that he's like pretty big into that streaming culture, which would make a lot of sense given everything with the game.
well, there you go. And I'd like to think that now that he's established himself as kind of a well-known-ish name,
Mm-hmm.
that he won't feel the need to resort to that kind of thing, and he'll have more creativity or more personal license to write a story the way that he wants to without having to resort to like really tacky stuff.
Like, I do really hope that he's thought about these kinds of things. I know that in the past he's like kind of defended how he went about it, but that was like 2 or 3 years ago at this point. So hopefully he's grown as a writer and a creator in that time. And
Mm-hmm.
I am honestly looking forward to seeing what he puts out. And I will be playing the DLC that eventually comes out for
Mm-hmm.
Doki Doki Literature Club to see if that adds anything to the experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Good luck.
I mean, yeah, I see a lot of potential in it as a writer, and that's something I look forward to seeing him improve, basically, is what I would like to say.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
All right, and I believe I already said that I was kind of looking at all this in the context of does it succeed at the things it wants to do, and I think the things that it wants to touch on are depression and establishing itself as a meta narrative, and
Mm-hmm.
I think we've covered a few times. Like I think that neither of those things are really met, and that's why the whole experience just kind of falls flat for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's not a whole else we can really say. We've already dissected that pretty much.
I think that would count as our final thoughts.
Yeah. The story does not achieve what it sets out to do, in my opinion. But a lot of people seem to get something out of it. So,
If you did see this game as like a positive experience and made you more in touch with your depression or mental illness or whatever, more power to you, but it still should be acknowledged like this probably isn't the best way to go about depicting mental illness in media. And if you just generally enjoyed the game, again, more power to you, but
yeah. And I'm looking forward to the day where we actually get good representation of mental illness in media.
me too.
I don't think that's going to come for a while, but I really hope that we do get to that point.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to finish off on saying that, related to that, on the things that it sets out to achieve, I would like to make some recommendations. If there are games that do the kind of things that DDLC is looking to do better, basically. If you're looking for like a video game, a nice short video game that has this kind of playing around with the tropes and the limitations of the medium or the art form, it's not quite a visual novel, but it really reminded me of the Stanley Parable,
Mm-hmm.
which, to be fair, I just played right before DDLC, so that's probably why. But that does something similar, and the writing's great. It's a really good, fun, really funny short video game. It's definitely worth playing. On the topic of video games that deal with difficult issues, if you're looking for something close to DDLC, I would say that there's a game called To the Moon, which I think was made in RPG Maker, so it can run on a toaster.
Mm-hmm.
It deals with difficult topics very well, and it's very narrative focused. Another one which is more in the kind of spooky kind of direction is a video game called What Remains of Edith Finch. It deals with similar themes to DDLC, and it does a good job of discussing them. So those are, I would recommend, if you're looking for a game that scratches those itches consider those.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, that's what I want to finish off on.
If I had to recommend some games, I think if you want a good meta narrative, how a meta narrative should be done, there's actually two I can recommend. One is Irisu Syndrome, which is a late thousands block puzzle game.
Mm-hmm.
I won't say any more about that. And the other is, which is probably the closest thing to DDLC that exists, is You and Me and Her, which has got its first English release like late last year, early this year, something like that. But it's from 2013, and it's very good. And if you want a very short game that deals with themes of depression, I recommend Until We Meet Again.
Mm-hmm.
It's free and in English. Also, in the future, we would like to do this again with other visual novels that we actually enjoyed. So look forward to that.
True. I think we've ended on a positive note, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
I have nothing else I want to add. I'm pretty happy.
Me neither. If you want to support us, we'll have a donation link for Ko-fi in the description. Follow us on Twitter. Follow us, subscribe, like, Patreon, etc.
Throw a little comment, feed the algorithm, make
Mm-hmm.
us famous.
Like us or dislike us, it doesn't really matter, actually.
Just if you want to say shit in the comments and say that we're terrible people, go
Mhm.
ahead. The haters only make us more popular.
True.
So,
True.
yeah, that's it.
All right.
Cool.
See you next time.
See you. Bye.